Hello, everyone. Welcome to the source code front-end group session of October. And this month's topic is going to be shipping, trademark. So the way that we have this sorted out is the call will be split into 5 sections. I'll be trying my best to keep time for each one of them. We'll be covering them one at a time, and the idea is just I'll throw some questions around, and you please speak up and just share your thoughts or tips, or how you usually handle them, how you've been having success. Here we're looking for examples of success, not so much of things that need to be improved. Is like, how can we improve them? What's the things that we can do on a daily basis to not just succeed on ourselves, but also helping others succeed on shipping. That's the thing. The focus is on smooth shipping, continuously shipping, and being good at shipping. So yeah, the other thing I would ask is just, try your best to speak up and mention your things, but be succinct in your own explanation so that we have time for everyone else to go. And the goal of the session is to share as many tips as we can to make everyone more successful at shipping, as much work as we can at each milestone. So any thoughts or questions before we start? All right, awesome. Our first section is managing complexity. So one of the things that we have to do as engineers is every time we have a new deliverable, there's always like a ton of ways that we can go about it, like different paths, right? And one of the problems that sometimes we get is that we let ourselves go deep into the complexity hole, and things take longer than they could. So how do you usually do this? How do you avoid falling into this complexity hole, and how do you manage that according to technical debt? Like, how to avoid adding technical debt in those? Anyone has questions or thoughts about that, or tips?
For me, when I go through like manage a complexity, it's just breaking things apart, keeping things in smaller scope. Like, for example, this one's going to be focused on one area, and then I'll create another MR to manage another area. Just when you break things apart, A, it's smaller MR, and B, that allows people to review it very quickly. So instead of having like a huge amount of changes to review, you have smaller MRs, faster review, and faster shipping time.
Thanks, Samantha. I would say that we need to be mindful of that, to not go overboard. Mindful to not go overboard, because each MR has its own overhead of review. So yeah, definitely being very mindful of how we split them makes sense. Any more thoughts and tips?
I just want to go back a little bit. So just on technical debt, I think it's good to understand that technical debt is sort of okay, as long as there's then a follow-up to fix the technical debt. Yeah, I think sometimes the boring solution that we should aim for, 9 times out of 10 probably has some tech debt in it, because it's not always the way we want to do it. So I think always having a plan to follow up after that is something we should do. And then obviously we never get to the tech debt because all things come in, but that's a different story.
Yeah, but that I think you bring up a good point, which is striving for 0% of tech debt is not efficient, right? Like striving for 0% is not efficient. So we need to be good at like managing that as part of something that we live with. Okay, more thoughts. Bless you, Phil. Oh, cough. Justin, Thomas, any thoughts?
I feel like my thoughts are more geared towards the review section later.
Okay, no, that's okay. So I can add my 2 cents. If somebody can write, that would be great, so I can focus on speaking. The way that I see it, when you get a problem, questioning our approaches and rethinking them, like double checking, making sure that we're keeping it the simplest acceptable solution. And not letting ourselves go too much on the, oh, there's a great way of doing this, but I need to clean that part. So let me see how I can summarize this. I was asking you all to be succinct and I'm here rambling. Yeah, okay, so let's put it that way. Keeping the goal on shipping a solution that favors the user, like having the user in mind when building the solution. Because if it's something that is invisible to the user and it's only for me, then I have to make sure that I have time for it. It won't impact the shipment of other things. So it's focusing on the user and being aware of all of the surrounding workload that we have before we going around on exploration and sorry for the gender term, but the Boy Scout rule, right? Where we go and try to fix things that are wrong, that we see that are there, and that can lead us in a really slippery slope. That's kind of like something to be aware of when I'm picking solutions, and that's it. Kind of my contributions. Thoughts on that or questions? Well, since nobody has any questions, I'll just expand that a little bit, because whenever you're working on something and you see something out of place, it's normal for us engineers to see, oh, there's another way of doing this, and this will benefit the overall thing. But the way that Phil was saying earlier, if we create an issue for tackling that and argue for it to be scheduled soon after, you end up fixing the solution for the user in a timely manner, and you keep that technical debt, like that developer experience topic, in check. If for some reason it doesn't get scheduled, is because it's really not that important for us. Because if it is important, we'll end up scheduling it. And that was a big lesson for me as a whole, because we saw things in the batch comments. Remember, Phil, that we thought, oh yeah, we'll do this right after. And like a year later, we weren't even picking it. And the truth was, it wasn't that important. And if we had held off from shipping that feature because that was missing, we would be doing a disservice to the users, right? So I think that's an important point to keep in mind, is by splitting it out to a separate issue, we actually help the process of like just following its own course. Yeah. Any more thoughts, Thomas? Anything from your side? Thomas, you there?
I am now. I had to take a phone call. Sorry, I literally just got back, so I don't know what you just said.
So basically, I'm asking, do you have any? So take a look at the document to see if, like we're just talking about, keeping the goal of shipping the solution to the users, trying to keep the Boy Scout rule in check, and only when things are important and it won't impact other things that are scheduled. Mm-hmm. And then, like Phil was saying earlier, like if you have something that you want to work on to improve, open an issue, like technical debt. You can accept some technical debt going in, as long as you have an issue prepared for it, and you can argue for it to be scheduled right after that. That's the gist of what we were just discussing.
Yeah.
Anything else from your side on how to avoid going overly complex? And I know that is something that we've been discussing as a team, because our code base is very complex. So it's easy for us to see, oh yeah, I could totally fix that. So anything that you particularly keep in mind when you're addressing these things?
Well, I think maybe just a point for discussion. This isn't something we should write in the document, because it's the opposite of avoiding complexity. But I sometimes feel like we say we avoid complexity by just sort of following the same sort of patterns that we already have, but they are already complex. And so sometimes I question whether we're not just adding to the complexity by not avoiding the complexities. So like sometimes I'm really bad at this, is what I'm kind of getting at. Is I'm trying to undo some complexity that we already have, which is itself complex.
That's
and
useful.
I wonder where the line is where we're just adding on to the complexity pile instead of avoiding it. But
Okay.
I have nothing else.
No. I think I can take something out of that because
Justin, thanks for typing. Thomas is bad at this.
So I think there's one thing there, Thomas. Let me unpack that, which is the temptation of reusing something that it's in the code base. Just because it's in the code base, it's high because it's there, and we end up spreading complexity, and in that sense, we end up just spreading complexity around. Now, going back to shipping, what's the most productive decision there? So let's see, we have something that we need to copy, like a behavior or something, and we already have something like that in the code base, but it's like legacy code. Like Phil, how do you usually handle these things? Like you have to do something, but you see like a code base example that it's really not good, but it will get you across the line. How do you do that in that case?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just so used to the legacy code. I just don't even think about it anymore, really. It's just becoming, the legacy is just part of my brain, is that it's just, I figure they'll just use it. It works. I think that's what we need to say, is the complexity affecting the end result, is that we're shipping to the user. If we can still ship to the user and the complexity is kind of high, even if we're adding to it, it's probably okay because it's going to the end user, and then we can tackle actually fixing the complexity as tech debt. Which is the legacy stuff. The legacy stuff is just like ingrained in my brain, is that it's just the second nature for me to like look at it and use it, understand it.
Right. But I think there's value there, which is, you said something really good, which is to keep in mind whether this will help the user or not. And then coming back later to fix it, which it kind of feels against avoiding complexity, but in a way you're keeping in mind the shipment of the solution. And I think we have a great example recently where Samantha was doing on the reviewers, and we were just like, hey, we have the dropdowns for the assignees. They're completely like, it's old, we don't love it, but it will get us across the first line. And we did that, and we were able to ship that in time instead of going overly complex right from the start. Now we're looking into breaking it down and to improve it, but we were able to ship the first version of the dropdown. Like the feature itself was held up, but from other perspectives, from other features. But that example to me speaks to this that you're saying. Like, it was old code base, we spread it around, so we made the product more, the code base more complex, and we even committed the sin of repeating ourselves. So we didn't, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, Samantha. But we accepted that cost because he got us over the line. And I think that's a good example, right? Anyone disagrees?
So I just really want to point out that example. I'm pretty certain that me and you had a conversation one-on-one where I specifically said we should go for the end solution of the dropdown. And that was like a super complex, and I'm so glad that we didn't go that way and we reused something and sort of reduced the complexity. So yeah,
right.
That's a good example to use. Awesome.
That's good to know. Okay. And I do think that is worthwhile keeping in mind when you're doing these sort of things, which it feels very counterintuitive on it, right? If like Thomas was saying, like, I'm spreading complexity, I'm making it worse. But understanding it in the mind of the roadmap, if you take a look at right after that, we have another issue to actually build the right thing. It allows us to get to market really quickly. And that's what we're talking about here, like keeping the shipping in mind and having that as the number one priority. And I think one of the things that I would add here is the engineers by nature don't like throwing away code. That's something like I took so long, I took some time writing this code. I don't want to trash it. But if that gets us over the line earlier, like to have that, like an afternoon of coding or a day of coding that will get me over the line instead of spending 2 weeks of coding a feature, that's worthwhile. It will get the feature out, and then we can go back, throw that out, put in the new code base. I think this is a harder problem for UX because users will see different things like very, very quickly, but that's something that we can live with our own product approach. So yeah, so basically I think the bottom line here is just to get comfortable with throwing away code if it gets us over the line earlier, kind of thing. Cool. Any more thoughts on this?
It would be good to sort of know where the complexity comes from. Is the complexity coming from the product side, the UX side, or the code side? Because they're kind of different things. Like product will always aim to get the best solution first. UX will sort of aim for like that as well. And then really the solution that we can go for is probably the one that gets us there quicker, which probably doesn't really match what product want most of the time.
That's a really good question. Anybody has thoughts? Well, I have thoughts. One of the things that I always think is when we're looking at mockups from designers, see that as the intention, but not necessarily the best code approach. So question those. The mockups are guidelines; they're not contracts. And we have the benefit of having a great designer on our team that is very understanding when we negotiate with them about, hey, we can do this in like 2 weeks, or we can ship this in a day if we just reuse this component. It's slightly different. It's not the same experience, but what do you think about this? And that's a conversation that we can totally have. Like trying to negotiate with the designers and with product too, if that's the case. I feel like that's something that we need to keep in mind. And I always go back to John Gruber's talk on the auteur theory of design. I'll get the link in the document. Because he says the front end, or basically the developers, are the last people to touch the code, the thing that will be shipping. And we have not just the opportunity, but we have the responsibility to own that. If the designers are sending us something that is broken, or we experience it and we don't like it, it's totally our responsibility to bring it up to them and, hey, look, I have this solution. It's far better. It's quicker. So that conversation needs to happen, keeping in mind always the time to shipping. Like if it decreases the time to ship, definitely invest in that conversation. If it increases, try to find other ways to get that over the line. But just keeping that in mind is definitely something that is important. We're the last line before people say. Users don't interact with mockups. That's why I use that line. Mockups are guidelines, not contracts, because they won't interact with the mockups. They'll just interact with the code that we write. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
I find that this is hard to do sometimes, because at least in my interactions, like with Pedro, he's always pushing for like the next best thing, and it's always like just a tiny bit more. It's like, oh, what if there was like one other click interaction here or something, and I can almost always accommodate those, but it's like one more review cycle or one more thing. And so it's just like, yeah, it's totally feasible. We could totally do this, but it's just a little bit out of scope. So like those are kind of hard to catch because they just seem so small usually, but it can always be done in the next iteration.
I think, yeah, you bring up a very good point. Designers, when they're doing the review, like they'll always have a few things that they need to tweak. And I think you bring up something very useful on the retrospective this month, where like, is this a blocker? Like that conversation, like, and I remember Samantha does this very well, where there was, I can't remember what the feature was. I think was the filter per author on commits, where, yeah, we shipped the feature. And then right after we had like an issue with 5 points of polishing the UI, right? And it's like, we shipped the feature, it's done, it's out there, but it's not perfect. And as we saw recently, we have to be very mindful of whether those like tweaks are actually just cosmetic, or they actually impact the way the users interact with the feature, like we saw. So we're in a very mature stage. That conversation needs to be there as well. So in your situation, what I would say is just see if we can bundle them up into a separate issue. Like, oh yeah, that. Can we do that right after this, a separate MR? But yes, it's easy to fall into the temptation that I'll just add it there.
Definitely, just want to add, it was so challenging when I when I first started to like, the designer loved to add that one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. And as engineers, we always try to accommodate that. But what I realized that one more thing leads to a longer review time. And even if it's tiny, even they go, oh, this is just a tiny change. I'm like, this is out of the original scope. I go, you know what? I'll address that in a follow-up issue. And then if I have time during the sprint, I'll address it. If I don't, I'll push it to the next sprint or something like that. But sometimes I group it together. Like Andre said, I'll group similar issues together, or sometimes I might create separate issues because sometimes they might think it's one more thing, but it can it can open a larger can of worms. So sometimes I know it's challenging, but I think it's, as engineers, like Andre said, focus on shipping time. Say, hey, is it okay if I create a follow-up for this? And if they say no, they're like, oh, this is paramount, then we can address it. And then you can always go back, hey, this is why the review time got delayed, because this was paramount to the ship. So sometimes you can ask that question, hey, is this necessary for this iteration? If not, can I create a follow-up? And usually they're quite responsive to discussions. But yes, very challenging because it's hard. But I think it takes a little bit of practice to be comfortable with it. It took me a long time, so I understand it's challenging for sure.
I'll add one thing there. I remember doing UX reviews that were very detailed, like pixel off, misalignment, that sort of thing. When we get those lists with screenshots, we've all seen them. Jump on a call. I know that sometimes it's hard and it's counter our values to be synchronous. But in those cases, I've had really productive calls with designers where it's like they're reviewing my code and they have a bunch of like pixel perfect adjustments and stuff. Like, hey, are you around? Let's jump on a call. And we just blaze through them in like 10 minutes. And like we tweak them, share the screen, we fix the code, and it's like far more productive. I know that time zones are an issue here with our team. But instead of like taking 2 cycles, right? You doing the thing and then sending it to them, you're doing it right away there. And you can work on other stuff in the meantime. So that's just a suggestion. Cool. Any more thoughts on this topic? The complexity coming from product design or code? Okay. Any more thoughts on the complexity? I can move on to juggling parallel work. We're good on time. Right. So if you do remember anything else later on the complexity, we can come back to it. Moving on, section 2. So juggling parallel work. As we were discussing earlier, the time that we take on one deliverable impacts the time that we have available for the other. That's something that needs to be on our minds constantly. That's why we do the kickoff early. And we set up you all started to kind of like forecast the plans per week, more or less in your minds. And that's because we need to prepare for the capacity that we're going to need later for other work. And as we're waiting for reviews from the current deliverables, that's the great opportunity for us to jump on another stuff that is waiting. But how do you avoid being overwhelmed by multiple topics in flight? Any tips?
This has been like super top of mind for me recently, obviously. So I can't say that I'm like an expert at this, but I think the thing that's been working for me this week at least has been, I have lots of things lingering that just like aren't closing out. But what I'm doing is like, anytime something pops up, if the oldest one takes priority, so like the longest running thing takes priority, and I work on that until it is out of my court again, and then it like I shut it down and I move to the next oldest thing. So that's been kind of my tact right now of avoiding like having to work on multiple things at once. Unfortunately, I do like so if something pops up like an old review that it keeps coming back, that's something where it's the next thing in line, but I'm not working on it immediately. So like the next time I get to a point where the one I'm working on now has to stop, whether it's for a review or a broken pipeline or something, or a running pipeline, that's when I jump to the next thing, is when I'm waiting, not immediately. But
Was that the end of your thought, Thomas?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah,
But,
go ahead.
For me, I have a hard time context switching, and I found that when I divide my days very concretely, that's helped me a bunch. So first thing in the morning, I check email and do all of my reviews and things that kind of popped up overnight. And that's usually when I'll handle any reviews that I have in flight. And that usually takes me through to lunch. Then when I come back from lunch, I close email and I basically stop looking at Slack and focus heads down on whatever my big rock items are until those are done. That's helped me a bunch, just delineating. That keeps me from context switching too much.
That's really good. And I find that actual division sometimes switches between time zones. When I was in California, I did the opposite. I had meetings and emails in the morning, and then I would look at my focus stuff on the afternoon. But here in the US, in Europe, I do the other way around. Have far more meetings in the afternoon. But yeah.
That's an excellent point, because my day is structured that way because most of my reviews and feedback come from Europe, whereas I guess never does. Whereas I'm in Central Time Zone in the United States. That way I can address, ideally, their issues before they're gone for the day and let them, without blocking them too much. So yeah, it's an excellent point to keep in mind, is where you are in relation to the rest of your team.
Awesome. More thoughts on juggling parallel work? And basically the question is how to not get overwhelmed. Phil, do you have any thoughts on this? How do you not get overwhelmed when you have multiple things in flight?
So we're kind of lucky, maybe a bit unlucky in the fact that our pipelines kind of take a long time to run. So normally when the pipelines are running, we sort of have enough downtime to then go on to the next one. But yeah, I split my days up pretty much the same. My mornings normally reviews. I go for my to-dos the bottom upwards. I ignore any stuff that's related to my work that'll go last in the queue. And then based on them things that are last in the queue of my stuff, I'll take the more complex ones first, or maybe it depends. Some of them like are super easy and I can like get them out kind of quick, and maybe it's like a few little lines, code changes or whatever, and they can get out quite quick, and then they're off my plate altogether, and I can focus more on the complex ones. Or sometimes the complex ones are a bit more urgent and they'll go first. So it sort of depends month to month. But that's all my days go like.
So yeah.
Go on.
I was going to ask you a question. You started by saying, yeah, since the pipelines take a long time, you have time to jump on other things. But don't you ever like start too many threads? And I know that you somehow master this. I've seen you like handle like 5 threads at a time and not skip a beat. Is there anything in particular that you do to keep them running its course? Because it's easy to keep jumping around, and you never take it to completion. So is there anything particular that you can think of that helps that?
I think it's just a learned behavior. It's sort of just how we've always been at GitLab, is that this is just how we do things. Multiple things get assigned. It used to be slightly different, and maybe it's how I learned, is that previously when I first joined GitLab, we would pick from a big long list of issues to work on whenever we wanted to, and you would never get assigned work. So you would never be given multiple things to work on at once. You choose it. So when you finished working on an issue and the pipelines are run, and they used to take much longer, like maybe up to 2 hours they would take. So you would have a lot longer to then work on a different issue. And if you didn't pick another issue, you'll be sat there bored and just twiddling your fingers and not really know what to do next. So I think it's sort of learned behavior from that time a bit, really.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you used to just kind of pick issues as soon as you were ready for them, because that's actually something that Samantha brought up in either this retro or the last retro, of like more of the Kanban style of like just pull issues down when you're ready for them. I guess we moved away from that so that we can have more like cohesive product releases. Is that sort of the idea? Kind of.
Predictability is a big thing. And the thing is, not all issues is kind of the same. So the Kanban style is like you have a linear pile and people will take off the top, right? But for example, that kind of, it's great for sharing knowledge and circulating knowledge. So for example, approval rules, instead of being something that mostly Samantha worked on, or the repository browser, something that mostly Phil would work, it would be random. Like all of you would be picking up all those issues, which is good for spreading the knowledge, not so much for like the speed and efficiency and predictability of the code, of the shipment. What I think might work in some ways is a mixed approach, where we do that approach for bugs, where we have a pile of bugs, and I've seen great feedback from all of you on having a lot of bugs prepared to be picked up, because if you have free time, stretch items, for example, are one of the cases. You will pick them up whenever you have time and you work them, more than feature work. Because we always do those things about, for example, and going back to this previous milestone, Thomas, you voiced to me that you have an appetite more for the back of the front end work. And Phil, you were telling me that you would like to be working more on user facing things. Like those kind of control goes away when it's Kanban. It's like random, right? And then if you start picking, like not the very top, but the second one, then you break the whole flow of the Kanban, and it's kind of like a little bit chaotic. And it's hard for me to tell the product manager, yeah, we're going to get to that particular issue at the end of the milestone. So there's some trade-offs there, but we can definitely take learnings from those parts. Like having a Kanban style to dealing with bugs could be something we try. The one thing that Kanban also has to this topic, juggling parallel work, is they usually have a maximum of things in flight, which is something that I wanted to bring up here. I'm going to put a topic for this, limiting open threads. The way that it works is like you pick something off the pile, but you don't pick something else until some of those are delivered to completion, right? 2, 3, the number can vary. It really depends on each person. But I feel like that has other benefits, because if you're stopping yourself from picking other things, it's giving you more time to work on other parts of your job, like code reviews, pursuing maintainer role, learning more a particular skill while you're waiting for certain reviews. It feels like a waste of time, but sometimes you might be given that time to work on other parts that if you're just constantly picking things off the pile, it's not going to be more productive, because you end up being more paralyzed because of the whole things in flight. So I think that's something that if you're struggling with this, that's something that I've recommended to some of you in the past, to limit the time, the amount of stuff that you open up. The one thing that I would say is using your best judgment, because if you have 2 things in flight and you have those 2 in review, and those are feature work, and you have like a copy update of a bug, then that's kind of like no cognitive overload. That's just like updating the copy, shipping it. That's something you can still pick up and go over your limit, right? So using a common sense approach on there, like, can I go over the limit? Shouldn't I? It's up to you really, but it would stop you from picking up another complex work, because complex work is the thing that's going to take multiple iteration of reviews and a lot of cognitive load from your side. So yeah, kind of like a gray area, not a soft limit kind of thing.
So I just want to sort of point out, even though we used to just pick from a big backlog of issues, it was sort of because we didn't really have any product managers. The person that would schedule the work was either the UX designer or the front-end manager, or we would just randomly pick them ourselves from like 50 different pages we'd scroll through. So even though we did pick from a list, it wasn't really an organized list of issues to work on. It was just absolutely chaotic, and some people would work on tiny things and some people would work on bigger things.
Do you remember how many? Yeah, do you remember how many front end we had back then? That was before Tim, right?
So if we go back to when I first joined, there'd be 2. So there'd be the front end manager and then me, and then about a month later there was another one, and then I think maybe 2 months later 1 more.
So it's like less than half a dozen.
Yep.
For the whole company total?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was here then. He was the first front end to be hired. And what, actually, I think this brings up a good thing. Do you want to tell the story of how you shipped the issue boards, the first iteration? Just broadly.
Yeah. Okay. So issue boards kind of like, it was the biggest thing that we'd done at the time. It was wasn't technically the first view feature, but it was like the biggest view feature that we'd done. We got given, I don't even know, did we work from like, I think we worked from like the 21st of every month to the 21st. So it was kind of like chaotic if there was a bug on the last days. 5 times out of 10, you wouldn't be able to fix the bug before shipping. We did the front end and back end both in the same branch. It had like a ridiculous amount of changes in it. We had so many different people reviewing it. The front end was done in about, probably took the front end maybe just over a week to finish. The back end was roughly done in the same amount of time, and it took maybe another week or so just to finish off the tests and get it done. It probably took us maybe like 3 weeks to take it from start to actual finish. And bear in mind, this is at the point where we didn't really have any guidelines on how to do Vue. Most of the people at GitLab hadn't even looked at Vue. So there's a lot of like new things that we were learning at the same time. But yeah, it was kind of interesting. I don't want to do it again though.
Yeah, but I wanted you to tell that story just so that we can get that perspective. Like way back when we didn't have many hurdles to go through, like we were able to ship something that we didn't have issue boards, and then 3 weeks later we had issue boards. And I feel like
and we also didn't have feature flags either.
Right.
So the code that got merged to master was going into the release and was going to GitLab.com. There was no like hiding it or anything. So it had to work.
Now, we all understand that this is anecdotal. Like we know that we're not living in that maturity stage anymore. Like we understand that, right? But I feel like this speaks to those learned behaviors that Phil was speaking earlier, right? Just constantly being shipped and just be like that bias for shipping is there, which I think we sometimes coming into a later stage in the company, we can learn the other behavior, which is to be very protective of what we ship, to be very, I don't know if this is ready, so I won't be shipping this until I'm very, 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 very sure. So there's something there that we can learn in that as we're getting more confident with the code base and everything, keeping the focus on shipping constantly is something we can learn. So that bias for shipping. Cool. I would say though also that adding something new to the code base is always easier than maintaining something and adding on top of the existing code base. So that disclaimer as well. All right, let's look at the time. All right, wrapping up the section 2. Any more thoughts on juggling complexity? No. All right, so we can go on to smooth reviews. All right, so a big part of what we do is reviews and having our code reviewed. And all of us do code reviews. So we are on both sides, both on the author side and also on the reviewer side. So we know kind of what we like to get from authors as a reviewer. So I'll throw the question out there, like, is there anything particular that you do to prepare your work to help the reviewers? And how do you handle the changes requested by the reviewers in a way that is helpful to continue that review smoothly?
I would say my number one thing with getting changes from reviewers is always put them in a separate commit. Don't like force them into the same. You can amend without editing a commit and and I hate when people do that. I've had that happen several times where I'll give somebody a bunch of feedback and they'll make, 3 or 4 dozen lines of code changes squashed in the same commit, and now I can't see the difference easily. So if you always put that in a new commit and then squash it later, like Andre's a big fan of fix up and I am now as well, that makes, from a reviewer's perspective, way, way simpler. And even from a coding perspective, when I'm working on it, it helps me keep track of what I've addressed and what I haven't when I spread them out over new commits.
Just on that though, isn't that what all like versions drop down is meant to be? Is that it will be able to compare one version against the previous one?
Sure, but you don't get that if they've amended them with no edit and force pushed it back up.
Yeah, I've seen people mention it, just I can never use them drop downs because it can confuse the hell out of me.
I think the drop downs are still broken. I don't think that it's last I knew it always compared against head. You could never compare against like whatever version you select, always compared against latest. So you can never compare against like the last 2 versions, for example.
Ooh, really?
Yeah, I think that's still a problem.
But that's a bug. Like,
yeah, it is a bug.
okay, so bugs aside, I wanted to address this because I think that's what Justin said about easily, right? Because if you think about, like, if you do a rebase, that's going to throw another version on the MR. If you do another push, you're going to do another version on the MR. And sometimes you have like 8 unnamed versions. The unnamed part to me is the killer. That yes, it's useful to have the comparison, but it's not easy, right? If you have it by commit, like address comments regarding tests or something, it's far easier for the reviewer to go in there and just click the commit and navigate per commit. So it's easier. But you're right, like that's what the versions are for, the dropdowns are for, but as we see, they're not easy to use for that particular case. Now, do we see this from a reviewer perspective? Do you think that this helps? This is for everyone. Like having a separate commit for the changes.
Okay, whatever's easier for the author, I guess. I can't say it really made much difference to me.
Okay. From my perspective as a reviewer, it definitely makes me quicker to review the second iteration of the review when I can clearly see what was changed. So I definitely agree with that. This makes it easier for reviewers to even if they don't appreciate or even if they don't notice it, it's tidier. Now, it still asks the question about, so when do we squash it? Do we squash it on merge by using the option to squash all commits, or do we squash it before we merge? Any thoughts?
Squash a bunch of times. So presumably every MR has to go through a primary reviewer, UX, and a maintainer. And usually the primary reviewer will get done first. And after any of their things, I'll squash there. And then if the UX needs any changes, some new commits there. And then when they're done, I squash there and then send it to the maintainer. Now, if the maintainer needs updates, then you add commits and they might just merge those before they get squashed. But that's more or less fine, I think.
Okay. No, I feel like that's good in terms of squashing every time you're squashing the extraneous commits when you're moving to a new reviewer kind of thing.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll ask a maintainer like, hey, can you hold off on merging this so I can just like squash all of the changes that we've made? But I don't think it really, it squashes. I mean, it all winds up being one commit anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Well, I don't. That's a question for everyone. Do we always squash? Because I think that depends on the maintainer. The maintainer actually decides whether to squash them or not. What's the standard approach?
I always click the button. I don't know if I'm meant to always click the button, but I do anyway.
To squash, yeah.
I squash everything.
Yeah, I've seen cases where authors specifically ask to not squash it when they want to have the commits individually. That's when they took really good care of like keeping the history clean, that sort of thing. But yeah, by default, I agree. Like squash the hell out of it.
I kind of feel like if you don't want to squash your merge request, then perhaps that should have been multiple merge requests.
That's
you feel that strongly about it. That's
a good hint. That's true. Yeah, but I like this this thing, and the thing that you were mentioning in the beginning, Justin, about it's very easy when you're doing tweaks and commits to know which commit you're fixing. So having the fix up, it's very easy to just then after everything just squash it automatically. If you have multiple commits, like, and the way that I remember, like when it was big features, I always remember like there were 2 to 3 main commits. That's it, not more. And then all the rest would be iterations that would be cleaning, tweaking, and fixing. So if you're squashing them into individual different commits, then it makes sense to use the fix up. But I like this approach, and let me just document a little bit. So, so as a summary, this is actually inside this. Keep commits clean. Each iteration or review gets a different commit. Squash, how do we call it? Review commits? Commits when passing to a new reviewer. Of course, if you have multiple reviews at one time, then you're going to have to live with the noise. That's fine. And then squash upon merge by the maintainer. Like that's the summary of what we were discussing here.
One thing that I've just started doing, I suppose, as a reviewer, not as the author. Like last night, I was going through someone's MR and there were just a bunch of like really annoying things that Prettier had done, like leaving carrots on random lines. And I was about to leave like 4 comments like, hey, we should fix all these. And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to push a commit for this. So I just like checked it out, like tweaked all those lines and pushed a commit up to it. So I think leaving all those comments like, hey, this is weird formatting that's like it's hard to see like what's actually happening because the line like wraps weirdly. It's just like 3 minutes to actually fix that. So that can help a review go smoother.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I do similar things too when I have large ideas, and it's just as simple to, even if I don't do a push-up like you said, and I stole this from Paul Slaughter, is really leaning on patches. Like build a patch for them and upload that directly if it's too big for just using suggestions. And that's helped a bunch, especially when you're reviewing something like we have the UX team pitching in to do a lot of the GitLab UI migration stuff, like moving all the new GL buttons in. And it's oftentimes way more helpful to just do the change for them because they're not engineers first, they're UX people. And if you're trying to explain to them how this test should be rewritten because it's broken or something, it's just faster. So here's the fix for the test, go ahead and have it.
Yeah, I'm torn a bit here, and let me explain why. I think this is very efficient in terms of like getting that MR ahead, but it teaches the wrong behavior to the authors. Does that make sense to you? In terms of like, if the maintainer or the reviewer is going to give me the code to fix this, I start getting sloppier next time that I submit an MR, which it's human behavior. So a grain of salt for sure. But here's a story that I was debating with myself whether I should do it. And the decisive factor that made me write a patch for the user was, it's going to be very hard for me to explain with words what I mean. And it was basically a CSS change. So that was the case where writing a patch was more efficient than explaining in words. Because teaching a person to fish or giving him a fish, you know that thing, feed him for life. As reviewers, we're also teaching them like the habits and patterns of code. And I remember I always use this approach. I don't know if I used it with any one of you, but when you join a new company, no matter how great of an engineer you are, you're like in a pinball machine. Like you're like the ball hitting the walls a bunch of times until you know where the walls are and you avoid the walls. By doing that work for them, you're removing that lesson, right? It's not, I'm not against patching. I think it has definitely a place, especially if it's like a Prettier or something and you're like, you're going to press merge or passing it over. So it's easier to just solve that problem and just for the sake of time moving it there. But be aware that if you're constantly doing that for the same person, you're enabling him to be sloppier in the future. Is that reasonable, or am I just being too strict?
I'm gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Justin.
I was going to say definitely. Sorry, I just wanted to re-point out that I think Andre said it really well when he said the kind of gut feel for that is when it's easier to explain with a patch than it is in just words what you're trying to say. Right. So it's not that you're doing the work for them; it's that here's what I was trying to get to more succinctly.
Right. Samantha.
I just wanted to add, like, the patches was super helpful. Again, it was like Paul Slaughter. I think when I was writing a spec test, and then you know how we have like with Jesters these like test case or the loop book. I can't remember how to. Anyways, I didn't know about that, and it was because of his patch. He's like, oh, a simpler way will be to do it like this, and because of the patch, I actually learned something. So I get where Andre's coming from, but at the same time, I find that patch is such a great way for me to kind of, it's such a great way to knowledge share. Because sometimes that code is like, oh, actually never thought about that. And you kind of pass that knowledge around a lot easier, like you said, than explaining it. But so I get it. So it depends. I guess it depends on what the patch is trying to achieve. Yeah.
And I think it applies to what I was saying. It was far harder for him to explain that in words. So by writing the patch, he taught you how to use those pattern tests. Yeah. But I'll write it here too. Any more thoughts on this?
I have a new thought on something different when we're done with this one.
Okay, go for it.
This is actually Thomas's idea, and I have stolen it and used it to great effect. He's the first person I saw who, when breaking up an issue into several MRs, he puts in his descriptions like a roadmap of where he is currently. And I found as a reviewer, that helped me a bunch because, and even as an author, when I'm sending to review and I do that same thing, I find that I get a lot more meaningful feedback. Whereas if I hadn't explained to them that, hey, this is step 1 of 4, that you'll start getting them reviewing things for the future, like, hey, you also need to include X. But because I've already allocated for, this is just for this one small piece, we're accounting for X in step 2, it moves it along much faster and answers a lot of those questions up front. So huge hat tip to Thomas. Thank you for that. It's been very helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
If nothing else, I over-describe.
Not possible.
Yeah, this is good. I always think about how much of a rule that would be. I think it comes to each author different ways. As long as you communicate the roadmap, that format itself is secondary. But it's definitely I've seen that, but it's definitely useful when you have multiple MRs coming. Yeah, Samantha does this a lot very well as well. Yeah, more thoughts on that? And I guess we can, let me just see so we're 15 minutes from the end in terms of content, and we are half an hour from the end. So we have plenty of time. We're good on time. Any more thoughts on the review part?
I have one, but I haven't done it personally, but I heard about it.
Right.
So maybe Phil will see this more. I heard that some people actually do a self-review of their code, like maybe adding, hey, I'm doing this because of the. Oh, this is odd, but then I have to do this because of the. So I wonder if that's helpful. I heard people telling me about, hey, maybe this is something I can consider adopting, which I plan on, but I haven't done it myself, but that's what I heard. So it'll be interesting to see if for like reviewers, if that's actually helpful, doing a self-review.
I think there's 2 things there to unpack. One, and I remember doing this and being very useful, is you should always do one passive review on your own MRs, but before assigning. That's a rule. Like, please do this all the time. It's so easy for you to miss something. And trust me, if I had a penny for every time I committed something that I shouldn't, like I added a file where I shouldn't, I'd be rich. So always self-review, which is to go through it as if it was someone else's code and review your own MR on assignment or before you assign someone, okay? The second is what you're saying, which is going through it and adding comments, explanatory comments for the reviewer. Is that what you're saying, Samantha? Yes, okay. So the first one, always do it. The second, Phil, thoughts?
So it's the best bit of advice I'd received from someone at GitLab is to always self-review. And it came after me pushing up, I don't even know how many merge requests of like awful code that I wouldn't even pass to myself. And it just sort of taught me these ways that the reviewer themselves will catch that, like maybe I should think about at the point of when I'm writing the code. And then it eventually taught me how best to become a maintainer or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's a great line. Don't pass code to someone that you wouldn't pass to yourself. Don't do unto others or something.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. As for the comments themselves, like leaving comments on the code, like instead of leaving comments in the code, leaving comments in the MR, like how do we feel about that?
What's
I'm
our
torn. I
Justin.
feel like if you have to explain why you're doing something, and I feel like that should be comments in the code, not in the MR. No, if there's a why, if the code itself is not obvious as what it's doing, that is definitely code comments, not MR comments.
Thomas, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think I was actually just going to say, I think that's kind of basically what our policy is, like in the handbook or in like the development guidelines or whatever. It's something like, if it's something that has to be explained in the code, then there should be comments. Otherwise, no comments. That's usually what I haven't really had anybody say, oh, we should take this comment out, because my comments are almost always like, oh, this magic number down here is because of like this file over here that we have to match or whatever. Like that kind of stuff needs to stay in the code. So yeah, I think just kind of backing up what Justin said.
Yeah, I'm on that too. I mean, it doesn't exclude that some situations might be very merge request centric, but if you find yourself explaining your code in the merge request, then definitely should be a code comment. But that doesn't mean that there won't be one or two cases where it makes sense to, yeah, I'm doing this because after this I'm going to have another MR or something like that. Sort of stuff is MR centric comments.
Yeah.
But yeah, explaining the code. Yeah. Code.
One thing that, and this is before GitLab even, but that I learned this, but usually I think that if I need to leave a comment in code, that usually tells me that it's not quite ready. It's not quite like readable enough, I guess. Like if I have to write something in English, that means the code isn't readable enough in English to take you through it. And sometimes that's unavoidable, but usually if I'm leaving a comment like, oh, this code looks this way because of XYZ, usually I can just like rewrite it to avoid XYZ, so I don't need the comment. So I think that's
a great point you bring up, Thomas, because if rewriting the code takes like a day and writing the comment takes 10 seconds, you know what I mean? Like that trade-off needs to be in our minds. But yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I was exaggerating.
Yeah, and certainly sometimes that's unavoidable, right? Like if you're like, this has to be like this because of something that we just can't avoid, that's one of the things where like, well, maybe it's a follow-up MR, but like we're just gonna leave the comment in for now.
Yeah, makes sense. Good, thanks for bringing that up, Samantha. So yeah, I'm gonna put that in bold, the always self-review as if someone's code. That one too. Like a big takeaway. All right, let's move on from reviews then. One of the next section 4, is dealing with unscheduled work. So this is something that I bring up into this conversation because there's always going to be things that we don't plan for, and that's always disruptive for our efficiency in shipping, right? But more than anything, in those cases, we need to keep shipping in mind even more than deliverables, because if we don't, we end up having yet another thread open for a long time. That's going to slow everything else down. So whenever something like a bug or a regression pops up and we need to tackle it right away, if we don't have the shipping in mind, everything is derailed, right? So it's even more special then. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about how you usually handle these things. What's the thought process that you have when you see a report on Slack, when you see somebody pinging on, is this known? Let's have a discussion about that. Broken masters as well. Like, how do you usually handle these things?
I guess I can give a recent example. There was a bug that Sid reported in collapsing files. I guess it was maybe already existed. I'm not sure about that, but it was one of those things where I had just been working on the collapsing file code. So first of all, when I saw it, and I think Danielle posted it, it was like something I could immediately like I wasn't even switching context really. I was just like, oh, I'm gonna look at this file again that I just looked at yesterday or whatever. So that was convenient. But usually those bugs are so self-contained that it's easy to like at least look at them and find out what the actual problem is, so that you can determine, or I can determine at least, whether I'm going to jump on that bug right then or not. Sometimes, however, the bug that comes up is like, oh, this is sort of fundamental to how this application works, and it's not something that we can fix right now. And that's when I just usually I'll leave a note like, hey, I looked at this and it seems like maybe it's this, and then I leave it alone. So I don't know what the right approach is.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. In that case, you had the benefit of not having to do context switching, but you still had to drop work, right? But to what I will highlight there, which for the topic here, is you were able to ship a solution on the same day that you picked it up. And that's what we want to see. So that's exactly the kind of approach that we should take with these reports, is not like, oh yeah, I'll take a look later the week or next week or something. It's like, if you do it right then and then, you can ship something on the same day, then you've basically did do great things. One is fix the problem, but also prevented it from derailing the others. And dealing with regressions is always tricky because they might be low severity, but if there are regressions on the current release, then we should tackle them right away, because we don't want to make things worse for customers. So that's something to bear in mind, is regressions is priority, and jumping at them with the mind of shipping something very soon. And that's in that moment, all the things we talked earlier about avoiding complexity and keeping an issue prepared for tech debt and stuff, it's even more paramount, right? But yeah, in that case, you shipped something very well, something very quickly, and you went for review right after that. You skipped reviewer, I think. You went straight for a maintainer?
I went straight to Phil, yeah.
Yeah. In that case, like, he was a domain expert. So you did everything well, like, in that sense. Fixed something very quickly, pass it over to maintainer very quickly, domain expert very quickly. So that's kind of what we want to see. More thoughts on this? So yeah, I definitely add focus on that part that I'd said about when you're dealing with unscheduled work, is it's not the time to do refactors or to improve the code base. It's just get that patch out. That's the greatest tip that I can give there. If we identify opportunities to improve, like Phil was saying earlier, create an issue and bring it up to me for scheduling for the next milestone. And I feel like that's having the efficiency in mind. And again, bringing the previous topic about keeping the user in mind, is like, even if the solution ain't great, if it just unblocks them or solves the problem for them, then we'll go with that solution. Yeah. Ship in caps, yes. More thoughts here. Broken masters. Have we been dealing with that? Do we just ignore? So this is an honest question. Like, whenever we see broken masters, do we take a look at them? Do we not? Do we expect someone else to take it, or is there usually somebody already took it? What's the situation there?
I must be like in the perfect time zone or something, 'cause I don't think I've seen a broken master yet that wasn't fixed by the time I saw it. That's incredible.
Yeah, usually what happens for me is I see the message come in. It's like, master's broken, check master broken for the thing. Mm-hmm. And I go look at it, and it's like they already have an issue open usually, and there's some, I guess maybe the bottom is an issue. Anyway, it's some like file, like a Ruby file or something. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to touch it.
So it's saying it's mostly backend that you see?
Recently it has been, yeah. I haven't seen any front end issues recently.
Okay.
Yeah. Ditto. Justin +1.
I guess if they're being fixed by the time it gets to your time zones, that normally the people breaking masters, then the people in the EU time zones.
Yeah, that's a fair view, but the deployments sometimes get held up, so it's variable. But yeah, it could be. I think it also about that thing about the shift change, like the changing of the guard, where you're closing up your shop here in Europe, and in the US they're picking it up. I do think we have great people jumping at these things right away. I have seen in the past backend jumping on front end issues. So someone like Stan or Patrick or other folks that I've seen jumping on these things. Sometimes it's something on a front end test, and they either fix it or they just quarantine it or something. But maybe we're just not looking at the right places, right? Because we do see when it's announced on the front end and the back end, on the front end channel. But I do think we have specific channels for watching that. And I don't think we have a record of breaking master ourselves in source code. I haven't seen much of that, especially in the front end. The ones that I've seen front end specific were about node version being updated or something like that. That really messed some things up. But okay, so in that case, then there's not much to discuss for the broken masters. Just something that I wanted to be aware of.
I'm sorry, I still think it's something we need to keep a check on, because even if it breaks a Ruby file, it could potentially be caused by a front end thing. Now, normally I will keep a check on it, and if it's something part of like the diffs or whatever, I will try and go in and fix it. If it's like elsewhere in the app that I don't really know about, then I'll just like leave it for someone else.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and thank you for bringing that up, because I have a terrible affliction where the second I see a Ruby file affected, I completely check out of the conversation. And it's good to keep in mind that it may have been a front-end change.
Yeah, at least basically just peek at the job that's failing and see if there's anything like a CSS class missing that they can't find or something. It's usually something on the front end that broke. Yeah, that's good. I wanted to bring another thing here into the mix. So we've talked about that, broken masters. We talked about the regressions. Yeah, so the one thing I would like us all to keep more eyes on is on the Is This Known channel, because that's where people are reporting like gut feelings and, hey, is this broken? Do you already know about this? And that's a great moment for us to maybe catch a feedback on something that we just shipped for features that we built, or just something that falls in the source code. And I do have what do you say? You agree? And the one thing that I keep in mind is it's like a garden, right? We have to tend to our garden to cut the little things that I'm not a gardener, but I just use that metaphor. You have to tend to these, right? And as we're finding bugs here and there, like if it's a very quick fix and we're in a lull between reviews, and even though it's not planned, jumping at that will prevent it from having to go through the triage process, through another milestone, and sometimes it's like just like a P4S4, like a visual regression. And we've had a couple of those in the past. So it might not be necessarily a regression. It might be something that has been there for a while, but only now was caught. And spoiler alert, as you probably saw in the OKRs, we're going to be focusing a lot more on transient bugs in Q4, things that happen sometimes, but not all the times. So if you see something like that, don't even ask for permission to jump at it if it doesn't impacting the deliverables. So I have no problem of you picking work like that that's unplanned if it's not impacting the deliverables. So use always that in mind. And this also goes to work that you'd like to see done. And Phil, you're great at this, where you see something that needs to get done and you just do it, and it doesn't impact the deliverables. I think that's the basic thing. If you come up with an MR for a particular feature that you'd like to be done, even if it doesn't have UX, having a prototype will probably put on Pedro's plate much quicker. Okay. And Phil was just sending me earlier something about a canned response on the comments of merge requests and nodes and everything. So something that we have an issue for it. We haven't really prioritized it, but Phil apparently loves it and he wants to have it a reality. So if you don't impact the deliverables, please feel free to explore these sort of things, because one, it makes us more productive. Two, it affects the product in ways that you would like them to go. But the big part here is to not affect the deliverables. Okay. But yeah, so that's kind of like my topic. The one thing that I would like, the caveat there is, if it's a feature issue and you know that there's a couple of people looking at it, and ask first, because we might be in discussion of specifying it a bit more or something. But if it's like if it's a bug, if it's an obvious bug, what it should be doing, fix it. Okay. Again, if it doesn't impact deliverables. Phil, you wanted to say something?
So that is this node challenge. It's sort of, I don't really see its effectiveness sometimes. But it's normally what I see is that someone will post a comment, and then maybe it'll go like unreplied to, and it'll like scroll up the list. And then you wonder, has anybody actually made an issue for this? No one's replied to it. So maybe it's not known, maybe an issue should be created. So it sort of like gets forgotten about and scrolled up. And then you also see on the other side is that someone writes a comment saying, oh, is this a bug? And then like 2 lines down, someone's wrote, is this a bug? Which is essentially the same thing as on like 2 lines above. And then neither of them get replied to, and it scrolls up the list and no issue ever gets created for it. It seems like another job for us to do. We have to keep track of issues, we have to keep track of regressions, keep track of master broken, and then we have to keep track of is this known. There's like all these different places we have to keep a track on.
Okay. And your point is that is making you less efficient.
Yeah, I just sort of forget about the is this known channel. I see it and I see the things come in, and maybe I'll see some kind of bad thing and I'll fix it. But
yeah,
I find it really hard to see that. I prefer the issues. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's like the single source of truth there, whereas there's is this no channel, and then there's the issues, and maybe they both don't match up or whatever.
Yeah, I might be over asking here, because I already pay attention to the is this known. Basically, let's just make that's a source for instant sort of up-to-date feedback. And you're right, sometimes they complain about the same thing multiple times. And we have like the champions that are always there, that always know exactly that, oh, this has been reported 3 days ago, like George and stuff. So they always know about those things. But yeah, it might not be like something for you to keep an eye on all the time, but being aware that it exists is at least something.
I wonder what the intended original purpose of is this known is, because I think that as a company everything starts with an MR, right? But even if you're not going to create an MR, issues are like how we look at work. So was the intent of is this known to like check really quick whether someone responded, and if they didn't, just create an issue off of it, and that's just not happening anymore?
That's a good point.
So what we used to find was that people would then write a comment in either the front end channel or the development channel and say, hey, is this known? And then someone would say, this is actually front end. And then you go to the front end channel and you'd copy the link across. And then they'd be like, okay, maybe it's source code. And then they copied the link across the source code. So it's sort of like this centralized place for all these people to ask questions of is this actually known?
Yeah. But to Thomas' point, I think that's the greatest thing we can do. It's like, we don't have to fix it on the is this known, but creating an issue is like the first step. And that's what I usually end up doing. Like every time somebody complains about something, I've become very quick at opening issues. Just write something, take a screenshot, ping the person who reported it, done, right? And then even if that's a duplicate, first, the feature that Phil built about searching related issues will probably catch it. And if it doesn't catch it, so you can just like let that go. And if it doesn't catch it, it will be picked up in triaging, and then either me or Phil or someone else will just take a look at it. Oh, we already have an issue for that. Boom, done. Labeled as duplicate, close it. But yeah, so basically there is just the bias there is not to fix things. It's just to provide an issue for each bug and everything. And I'm already there, but so definitely take that with a grain of salt. Okay. But I don't know if we wrote thing here about picking something that you'd like to see in the product and running with it. Like that would still be a point about if you see features that you'd like to be built and it's like a small thing or a breakpoint that it's not breaking properly, or like small things that you'd like to see in the product, like there's nothing stopping you from picking that up if it doesn't hinder deliverables. And I would welcome that. Okay. That's like a message I would like to send. Cool. And as a note on that, like I know that message can lead to being worse at shipping your own things. But if you're thinking about the overall picture, we're shipping more things because it's not affecting deliverables, and you're shipping that fix that wasn't planned. So in the overall, we're making the product more alive, like updating more frequently and everything like that. So yeah, that's kind of like the note. Right, we're 10 minutes out. Any more topics on the unscheduled work that you'd like to talk about? Any questions? Anything that's not clear? Nope. Cool. Going into section 5 then. Section 5, any other tips? This is the miscellaneous bucket. If you want to add anything else regarding shipping, apart from the topics discussed, what other tips can you share to improve the focus on shipping? If anything hasn't been said, now's your time.
Never go to the Is This Known channel.
That's the takeaway then.
I'm only kind of joking because I am of the personality that if something is broken, it will eat at me until it's fixed. And so if I'm behind on my deliverables, which feels like I have been for 9 months, I've gotten very good at just going into Slack using the all unread messages thing that it has, and just hitting bulk read for entire channels. And I do that with Is This Known and questions and a couple others if I'm just overwhelmed. I just don't even look at those problems. And maybe that's bad, but I make the assumption that my deliverables were hand-picked for a reason, that they're important and they should be taken care of first.
It's also interesting that because a lot of the content that's posted onto that Is This Known channel like isn't really relevant to us. There's only very like part of this small part of the app, and like 99, maybe a bit less, maybe like 90% of this post on there is like totally irrelevant to us, doesn't even belong into our stage. So we're like watching this content scroll through and it's just wasting our time.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Is this known? I didn't know that feature existed, let alone that problem.
Okay, that's cool. I'll move to my next one then while you think of other points that we might be missing. So this is something that I think I've mentioned this to all of you, but like it's easy to fall into that thing about, oh, it's the beginning of the milestone. So it's like, all right, the first week it's slower and that sort of thing. But if you keep the constant mentality of shipping things on each week of the milestone, we can get rid of some of the smaller bugs that we have scheduled much quicker and not have them slip sometimes because we were busy on the big ones. So, and I've heard in the past that it's like human behavior and just human nature to just, if you don't have a looming deadline, like we're just not as, we don't feel the urgency as much. And what I would recommend is like having your own self-imposed deadline, so to speak, per week, in terms of every week is ship week, every week is shipment week. And this is going back to the topics that we've discussed earlier about if you have multiple things, seeing whatever you can to fruition, like do it, like get whatever you need to do to get that shipped. That's always your biggest bet on getting things shipped, is keeping the constant and not be like, oh, this week is slower or something like that. And I'm not saying that somebody in this group does that. I'm just saying that it's naturally something that we've observed in teams that have like a month-long milestone. So whatever you need to do to keep that on top of your minds, please do.
So on that though, the deadlines sort of create this unnecessary stress on people, and that you will see that I've got to have this issue done by a certain date. Mm-hmm. And maybe you've left like a week or two and then oh crap, now they're like, the deadline's in like 2 weeks, I've got to like do something quick. Or like, no, the deadline's in like 2 days, I've really got to get this done now. So we sort of like ignore deadlines and just ship it when it's ready.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's okay if it goes to the next milestone, it's okay if it goes to the next milestone. Like, it's got to be in a ready shape to ship, rather than it being like a super stressful time for yourself. And it's like, it's just never worth being stressed over.
Yeah. So
and if product pushed to a certain date, just like say no to product. Say, do not even say it's coming on a certain date until it's like actually in the code, and then you can say it.
Right. So basically your point is like to not focus on the deadlines. Instead of having a deadline per week or something, it's just like getting everything getting everything ready whenever it's ready.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I do think weighting the work earlier is important, because near the end of the milestone, it does feel like there's a ton of pressure from or for product to actually have something to like, because they, the last week of the milestone, they're writing product releases and blog posts and like all kinds of stuff, and that's operating under the assumption that something will make it in the milestone. So the deadline feels like a legit deadline. Like if you don't get it in, then like everyone's going to be messed up. So there's some pressure there from product, I think. And Daniel has never come to me and been like, are you sure this is going to make it? And this really needs to make it, like blah, blah, blah. But there's still that implicit pressure, because he's like off writing blog posts and like off writing issues and stuff for features that he presumes will make it by the deadline.
So I'm probably going to be outstepping a bit here, but I would say sort of ignore them altogether. Like, that's their problem. Their problem is writing the blog post or whatever. Your thing that you need to do is ship the stuff that you've been assigned to. If they're putting undue pressure on you, that's their problem, not your problem.
Yeah.
Now, I could be going completely against like all values or whatever.
You're not, and let me tell you why. And that's my job. I'm the one who has to deal with product. You are protected by me. So if sometimes Daniel is normal to be reaching out to you because I'm out of the office or something, and always take those questions as a question, not as a push, because they need to have that information to know what to do their job. But don't feel pressured into, and we've learned that in the bad way, and I've made that mistake frequently. It's hard to say no, but in the recent stories that we had was the reviewers, they were made default to true last day of the sprint. That happened after I told product that this is not going to be ready to make it default to true today. And we had a conversation around, are we being overly protective or not? But that's my conversation to have with them, not with you. You focus on the continuous delivery flow, right? And whenever it's ready, it's ready. If it's not ready, tough luck. Like we flow over. And I've also had this conversation with product saying about, if we want to have extremely predictable commitments, we will be doing far longer planning and far more conservative deadlines. So instead of me saying that it will be shipping the reviewers in 2 milestones, I'll be asking for 6 months. If they want predictability, that's how people used to do in the waterfall days that we don't do anymore. We accept the unpredictability of our predictions. So my message to you is exactly what Phil said. Ignore them. I mean, answer the questions. Don't let them hanging. Answer the questions, but don't take that as pressure to ship earlier. That's a big lesson.
So my ears have heard you and my brain agrees with you. My heart is still going to be an anxious mess no matter what.
And that's why by default, they should come to me, not to you. But my message to you is always like, if it's not ready, let it slip. Like, it's not the end of the world. We'll flow over, we'll adjust. What we want to do is prepare a flow where the things that are just like very simple and straightforward don't slip because the others slipped. And just, you know what I mean? Like when you have small bugs and stuff, it's normal for them to slip as well because we have bigger things to fry, kind of thing. And if you have a process where we're constantly shipping and we're constantly like taking time to like get the things out that we can get out, we'll be in a far better position to, when it slips, it slips. It had to slip because there was nothing that we could have done. Like we saw something that we weren't expecting, or so yeah. This slippage that we've talked about is not to see that as the end of the world, but it's not also to see something as normal constantly, right? We have to be mindful that it's a negative thing, but it's not. It's like a scratch, right? It's like, it's there. It's like, nah, crap, I'm scratched. My cat scratched me or something. And we definitely want to avoid scratches because scratches are not cool. But but yeah. So in this particular question is like, don't take the product questions as pushing. I'm the one taking that heat kind of thing. But ship them when they're ready. But the focus is getting them ready whenever they're ready, and shipping as soon as they're ready. Just flick them onto production.
Yeah, I want to be clear also that I hope I said this properly earlier, but I'm not getting that pressure from Daniel. So like, he's not coming to me. I assume he's going to you.
Yeah.
But I still feel it implicitly, which I think is kind of what Justin was saying.
That's fair.
Exactly. Yeah,
That's fair.
There's no individual leaning on us. It's just Thomas and I looking at the Slack chatter and what's going on in the blog post and saying, "Oh, cool. I really don't want to let you down with that feature."
Yeah. Oh, great. They've got a blog post that it's not merged yet. So
exactly.
But yeah, to start, one of the lessons here then is the expected flow for the ICs is to work on a continuous delivery approach. Like, deliver it when it's ready. Do your best to have it ready as soon as possible, but in reasonable quality. But don't sacrifice that. But don't pay attention to deadlines per se. That's for me to worry about. Get them ready, ship them. Get them ready, ship them, and that sort of thing. Cool. We're at time, people. Any last minute tips that we can summarize in like a word or a sentence? No? Then we're done here. Anybody has anything before we go? All right. Before we go, I have to ask, how did you find this session? Is this something that we should do more often? Once every quarter, once every month? How do you feel about it?
Well, I just liked having everybody here in the same call and talking. It's been a while since we've like all been on one call together. So.
It's the kickoffs.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more thoughts?
I liked it quite a bit, even though I had a huge misunderstanding of what this was going to be. I don't know why, but I thought this was going to be a teaching session from Phil to the rest of us. Like, I thought this was like how Phil ships things because he's so good at it. I'm like, oh, you want feedback from me? Boy, am I unprepared all of a sudden.
That's fine. And I the one thing that it's normal is that we did get a lot of insight from Phil naturally because he's more experienced and he has a lot of experience with this and he's great at shipping. But I wanted this to have more of a conversation flow than a presentation because I feel like it's more real than we have someone telling you how they do their stuff and you don't have a voice. But we still got a lot of stuff out of Phil's minds, and we always do this. But yeah, so
yeah, like I could sit here and just talk about how I do things every day, and if that works for me, it might not work for someone else. And I think that's whenever the code review blog posts is that all them things are just the things that I do, and they may never work for anybody else. It's just what I've sort of corroded myself to do. So I could sit here and tell you exactly, I just could tell you exactly how I do it, and then you could try it and it would be the complete opposite and it just would go completely wrong.
And I'll just add that Justin, everyone on the team has stuff to add and to share as tips, and we want to harness that. So I feel like that was very productive from my perspective. I'm thinking that we can definitely do this more often. Well, it's the first time, so we're definitely going to do this more often if you did it the second time. But thinking once a quarter might be interesting. At the end of the quarter, having a session about something amongst ourselves. And this will be, I'll be uploading this to YouTube soon, and then sharing on the source code channel so that everybody can benefit from it. But thank you everyone for the time. Thank you everyone for the thoughts and opening up. But yeah, that's all I had. I don't have anything else. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, And I'll see you on Q4. It starts next week. Bye. Thank you.